Imagine a nation that prides itself on ingenuity. I mean, a country absolutely famous for its grit, for building world-class universities, and for funding top-tier research labs.
Right, a real powerhouse of innovation.
Exactly. But then imagine that same nation routinely dismisses the very experts who built those institutions. It is quite a paradox.
It really is.
Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are analyzing a phenomenal piece of work. We are looking at Richard Hofstadter's Pulitzer-winning book from 1963, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. We are going to explore how America turned the suspicion of the educated mind into basically an automatic cultural reflex.
And that is the core mission of our conversation today. We are going to unpack Hofstadter's sharp-eyed history to really understand this phenomenon. We want to test the strength of his claims, map out how they connect to larger societal patterns, and see how his ideas equip us, or perhaps fail us, when we look at today's debate surrounding expertise, populism, and authority.
It is going to be a fascinating exploration. But before we jump into the details, a quick note to set the stage for you. Experience a unique two-voice AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. Presented by Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yes, let's start with where people usually begin when they think about anti-intellectualism today. The everyday starting points usually fall into a couple of predictable buckets.
Right?
People often chalk it up to common sense, simply trumping ivory tower nonsense. Or, and we see this a lot, they blame it entirely on whichever political tribe they happen to oppose, while completely ignoring their own side's blind spots.
I mean, that is the easy way out, isn't it? Those surface-level takes treat intellect as if it were merely a snobby luxury. They fail to see it for what it actually is, a fundamental tool for human flourishing.
A tool we all need.
Exactly. By phrasing this issue just as a modern political squabble or a simple matter of street smarts versus book smarts, we dodge the much deeper historical question. Hofstadter forces us to ask why this resentment has simmered across centuries. It bubbles up everywhere, from 18th century revival tents to modern corporate boardrooms.
So let's get right into the text itself. How does Hofstadter actually define this concept? Because it seems like it means different things to different people.
He defined it quite specifically. He does not just say it is a lack of education or sheer ignorance.
Okay.
He calls it a resentment and suspicion of the life of the mind and of those who are considered to represent it, and a disposition constantly to minimize the value of that life.
Wait, so he is saying it's not just people disliking smart people. He is saying it is an active, resentful effort to devalue the entire concept of thinking deeply.
Precisely. It is an act of hostility. And what makes this book so fascinating is the context in which it was written. Hofstadter was prompted to write this in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Right, post-World War II.
Yes, he was heavily influenced by the McCarthyism witch hunts. He watched politicians actively target academics, writers, and thinkers as un-American.
A very paranoid time.
Very much so. He also watched the 1952 and 1956 presidential elections. The highly intellectual candidate, Adlai Stevenson, was relentlessly mocked by his opponents as an out-of-touch egghead.
It is funny to think about the term egghead being such a devastating political insult back then. I guess today's equivalent might be calling someone an extremely online nerd or a reply guy.
That is a great modern translation.
But Hofstadter does not just blame the 1950s, right? He argues this goes way further back.
He does. He argues that the McCarthy era was just a flare-up of a chronic condition. He believes this strain is deeply woven into America's Protestant heritage and pioneer individualism.
Okay, so how does he organize this history?
What is fascinating here is how he maps this out across four distinct historical roots or pillars of American society. The first pillar he examines is religion.
Let's take these one by one. Walk us through the religion pillar.
Hofstadter points to the evangelical fervor during events like the First Great Awakening in the 1700s.
For those of us who haven't been in an American history class in a while, give us the quick refresher on the Great Awakening.
It was a massive religious revival movement that swept through the American colonies. Picture giant, emotional outdoor tent meetings led by highly charismatic traveling preachers.
Lots of fire and brimstone.
Exactly. What Hofstadter highlights is that this movement heavily favored the heart over the head. It prioritized an emotional, immediate conversion experience over the rigorous, stuffy theological scholarship of the old European traditions.
So the vibe was you do not need to study ancient Greek to know God.
Right. The message was clear. You do not need a Harvard-trained minister to understand the divine. You just need a pure heart and intense faith.
I mean, that makes total sense as a democratizing force. But you can easily see how that turns into a distrust of anyone who claims you need to study books to understand the truth.
Exactly. It flips the hierarchy.
Okay, that covers the pulpit. What is the second pillar?
The second pillar is politics. Specifically, what historians call Jacksonian populism.
Referring to Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 1830s.
That is the era. Before Jackson, American presidents were largely aristocratic intellectuals. Think of Thomas Jefferson or John Quincy Adams. They were highly educated men of the Enlightenment.
Very proper, very scholarly.
Right. Andrew Jackson completely flipped the script. He campaigned as the rough-and-tumble frontiersman, the military hero, the common man. His political movement intentionally positioned itself against established East Coast elites.
So he made his lack of formal refinement a selling point.
Exactly. The implication was that a raw, untutored man of the people was far more trustworthy than a sophisticated, overeducated aristocrat.
It is the classic, who would you rather have a beer with test for politicians, which we absolutely still use today.
We certainly do.
So we have the church and the government. What about the workplace?
Because America is famously a business-driven culture.
And that brings us to his third pillar. Hofstadter identifies a mystique of practicality that permeates American commerce. A mystique of practicality.
Yes, this is the ethos that exalts the self-made salesman, the tinkerer or the practical builder over the scholar or the theoretician. Think of the cultural reverence for a Thomas Edison or a Henry Ford.
Men who built tangible empires?
Right. Men who succeeded not by writing academic papers, but by rolling up their sleeves and making things work in the real world.
Hofstadter's insight there isn't just that Americans like practical business people. It is that we actively distrust anyone who cannot turn their knowledge into a commodity. If you cannot sell your idea or build a factory with it, America historically assumes your idea is essentially worthless.
That is a brilliant way to put it. The life of the mind is seen as a luxury that does not meet a payroll. And that leads directly to his fourth and final pillar, education.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive. How can the education system be a pillar of anti-intellectualism?
It is a fascinating argument. He illustrates how the noble goal of democratized schooling, meaning free public education for everyone, which was a radical and wonderful idea, was gradually twisted into an anti-elitist utilitarianism.
How so?
Because the system had to handle millions of students of widely varying abilities, the focus shifted away from cultivating the mind and rigorous classical study. Instead, it shifted to simply preparing students for practical trades and citizenship.
So it became more about socialization and basic job training than actually teaching kids how to think critically.
Yes. Hofstadter specifically targets what was called the life adjustment movement in the mid-20th century. This movement argued that schools should focus less on algebra and literature and more on practical life skills.
Like balancing a checkbook.
Or how to buy groceries, or how to get along with peers. He saw this as a massive dumbing down of the American intellect, all done under the guise of egalitarianism.
To summarize, we have a historical pitting of practical folk wisdom against over-sophisticated expertise across religion, politics, business, and education. It is a sweeping historical argument. And it is fascinating to see how he weaves those four threads together.
It really is a masterful synthesis.
But I want to play devil's advocate for a second. It is easy to read this and think it is a perfectly packaged theory. But how strong are his claims, really? Does this hold up to scrutiny today?
The book's major strength is its empirical evidence. When you look at the historical record, his claims align very well with observable events.
The evidence is there.
It is. The evangelical disdain for elite rationalism is well documented. The business world's enduring cult of the self-made man is still visible on every magazine cover that celebrates high school dropouts who become billionaires. Furthermore, his argument is logically coherent. He does not just cherry-pick examples to make America look bad.
What does he do instead?
He highlights internal tensions. For example, with education, he acknowledges the tension between excellence and equality. He admits that democratizing education successfully boosted access for the masses, which is a triumph of democracy.
But there is a trade-off.
Exactly. He honestly confronts that trade-off. By accommodating everyone, the system inadvertently bred a certain level of mediocrity by lowering academic standards. He respects the complexity of the problem.
But the book has to have some blind spots. What did he miss?
He definitely has blind spots. While his historical sweep is impressive, many historians argue he overplays the religious angle. He treats almost all evangelical fervor as inherently anti-intellectual, which is an oversimplification.
That makes sense. Faith and intellect aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. But more notably, he significantly underplays left-leaning strains of anti-intellectualism.
I was wondering about that. He focuses so much on the conservative, rural, or business-minded rejection of intellect.
Exactly. He does briefly touch on that progressive life adjustment education we mentioned, but he largely ignores other forms of progressive anti-intellectualism. For example, he ignores what we might call intellectual anti-intellectualism.
That sounds like an oxymoron. What is an example of that?
A great example is the Enlightenment's myth of the natural man.
Meaning the idea that civilization and formal education actually corrupt us.
Yes, the idea popularized by highly educated philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau argued that pure, uneducated human instinct is somehow morally superior to cultivated thought.
Ah, the romanticizing of the uneducated.
Right. There is a long tradition on the political left of romanticizing the uneducated worker or the indigenous person as having a purer truth than the university professor. Hofstadter mostly glosses over that.
I would also add that his analysis of the business world feels a bit dated when you hold it up against today's landscape.
How do you mean?
Well, he focuses on the traditional traveling salesman and the industrial factory owner. But today, the most powerful business figures are a massive class of tech intellectuals and Silicon Valley disruptors.
That is a crucial modern distinction. Today's business titans often have degrees from Stanford or MIT. They are highly intellectual.
Right, but they still play into that old mystique of practicality, don't they? They might be coding geniuses, but they wear hoodies and sneakers to explicitly signal that they are not part of the old, stuffy, academic elite.
The aesthetic has changed.
Exactly. They still prioritize moving fast and breaking things over slow, deliberate, scholarly thought. So the underlying hostility toward traditional expertise is still there, even if they are tech geniuses.
That is a very sharp observation. Despite the shift from industrialists to tech billionaires, the core demand for immediate, practical utility remains.
So the book still holds up pretty well.
It does. Despite these missing pieces or dated elements, there are no major logical fallacies in Hofstadter's book. It just suffers from occasional overgeneralization based on the specific historical anecdotes he chose to highlight.
So we have these four threads: the religious fervor, the political bravado of the common man, the business practicality, and the educational utilitarianism. How does Hofstadter say these actually fit together in the American fabric? Are they just isolated phenomena?
Not at all. Hofstadter identifies a systemic feedback loop. These threads constantly reinforce each other.
Walk us through the loop.
Religious emotionalism fuels a kind of political paranoia against elites. That political paranoia then normalizes business practicality as the only trusted standard of truth. And that business practicality is then used by taxpayers and politicians to justify educational shortcuts.
It is like a machine that constantly feeds itself.
Exactly. The ultimate result of this loop is a cultural atmosphere where the intellect itself is made to appear somehow un-American. And this systemic view is what makes Hofstadter stand out from other critics.
That feedback loop concept really changes how you look at the issue. It makes me think of anti-intellectualism not just as mere ignorance, but as a defensive posture.
A defensive posture.
Yes, it is a shield people raise when they feel overwhelmed by rapid changes or highly complicated realities they cannot easily control.
That is a vital way to frame it. If you compare his work to alternatives like D.H. Lawrence's romantic anti-intellectualism, which glorified primal instinct, or modern critiques of technocracy, which focus purely on government structure, Hofstadter is unique.
Because he looks at the whole culture.
Right. He blames the national fabric itself. He argues that this defensive posture against complexity is woven into the very DNA of our culture. He pushes us to weigh the value of intellect against other deeply held American values, like character, equality, and democracy.
Let's shift gears and talk about the practical takeaways. What does this all mean for us today? How does understanding this history help us live well and treat others justly?
The real wisdom in this book lies in its championing of compromise over absolutism. Hofstadter raises a very poignant underlying question when discussing religious and political certainty. He asks, who would compromise with Satan?
Wow, that is a heavy question. Unpack that for us.
He means that if you view your opponents not just as incorrect, but as fundamentally evil or completely illegitimate, which is a common result of anti-intellectual emotionalism, then absolute certainty destroys any possibility of honest listening.
Because if the other side is Satan, compromise is a literal sin.
Exactly. But true democratic society requires a willingness to engage, to admit you might be wrong, and to find middle ground. Absolutism shuts all of that down.
I see. But there is a critical risk in Hofstadter's framing, isn't there?
What is the risk?
Well, by focusing so heavily on the virtues of the educated class and the dangers of the common man's populism, the book risks slipping into outright elitism. It can easily be read as treating everyday folks as easily manipulated dupes who just do not know any better.
That is a very fair warning, and it requires us to look at the text critically. Apply a sort of golden rule test to the text. On one hand, Hofstadter urges the protection of informed discourse so that all people can flourish, not just the educated elite.
He sees intellect as a universal need.
He genuinely does. Yet, if we reverse the roles, his critique completely overlooks how anti-intellectualism actually functions as a necessary shield for the vulnerable.
Right, because skepticism toward experts is not always crazy. Sometimes it is a completely rational defense mechanism against manipulative authorities or technocrats who genuinely do not have the public's best interests at heart.
History gives us plenty of reasons to be skeptical.
Exactly. History is full of highly educated people making terrible, destructive decisions from their ivory towers.
Precisely. The book nudges us to prize intellect as a civic muscle. It is a muscle that needs to be exercised by everyone to defend liberty against the kind of know-nothing populism that erodes rational debate.
But we have to keep it in check.
Right. This is the crucial balance. Intellect should never be used as a snobby status symbol to look down on others or to dismiss their lived experiences.
If you are listening to this and wondering how to explain these concepts fairly to others or how to bring this up in debate, a great personal framing might be looking at recent history.
How so?
Well, if you ever wonder why phrases like trust the science spark such a massive visceral backlash today, Hofstadter essentially wrote the playbook on why that happens back in 1963.
That is a great connection.
You can point out to your friends that this backlash is much deeper than modern politics. It is rooted in our centuries-long history of distrusting book smarts.
That is a fantastic real-world application. And if you are bringing this into a classroom or a book club, a great prompt to start a discussion would be Hofstadter nails the historical critique of religion and business from the 18th to the 20th centuries, but what would be your counterexample from today's college campuses?
Oh, that is a good one. It forces people to take his historical framework and apply it to modern environments.
Perhaps even environments that consider themselves highly intellectual. It asks whether anti-intellectualism has mutated and found a home within the very institutions built to protect the mind.
For those of you who want to explore this topic further, there are some excellent companion resources to pair with this text. You should definitely check out Hofstadter's companion piece, The Paranoid Style in American Politics.
A classic.
It really expands on that idea of political absolutism. And if you are interested in the technocracy angles we touched on, Theodore Rozak's The Making of a Counterculture is a fantastic read from the late 1960s.
Highly recommend that one.
And of course, nothing beats primary sources. Try reading some of Andrew Jackson's campaign speeches or the original McCarthy hearing transcripts to see this rhetoric in its raw historical form.
Examining the historical roots of our biases is absolutely essential. It is not about proving one political side right or wrong. It is about understanding the foundational DNA of our reactions.
It gives us perspective.
It does. Doing so helps us navigate today's world of relentless information overload with far more clarity and empathy.
It has been a fascinating journey through a truly foundational book. It changes the way you read the news, that is for sure.
It really does. And we invite you to check out our companion summary, analysis, and other genre-based podcasts to continue thinking critically about the ideas that shape our world.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.
And to leave you with some food for thought, here are 4 final, provocative, open questions to carry into your own discussions. Number 1, does Hofstadter's religious critique hold up today? Or does modern faith's emphasis on humility actually bolster the intellect rather than diminish it?
That is a great question.
Number 2, how has business anti-intellectualism evolved with the rise of Silicon Valley disruptors who leverage massive intellectual power while still mocking traditional expertise?
The hoodie aesthetic we talked about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Number 3, is democratized education a net win for a free society, even if it inevitably dilutes the highest levels of academic excellence?
The classic excellence versus equality trade-off.
And finally, number 4, can populism successfully check elite overreach and hold experts accountable without tipping over into dangerous know-nothingism?